Anaximenes lived between 580 and 500 BC. He was most likely a student of Anaximander from the same area in Milesia. So we have Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, all from that coastal area in what is contemporary Turkey. And Anaximenes postulated air as the arche of all things, as the first principle, the one thing that is foundational for everything else that exists. Now, I will go ahead and write this and pronounce this as air. Your text introduces the idea that it may be something slightly different, spelled A-E-R, that is denser and more moist, we might say, than air. But for our purposes, it's not really going to make that much of a difference for what we have to say. Now, recall that Anaximander postulated something that was unobservable as the arche. And that's consistent with numerous stages of scientific advance, as we mentioned when we talked about Anaximander. For example, just talking about atoms or X-rays, thinking about electrons, magnetic fields, even planets around distant stars. At first, we postulate something that we cannot directly observe, and then hopefully, as scientific progress goes on, we develop the technology to more clearly identify what we're thinking about. But that was Anaximander's method. In contrast, we have Anaximenes. Anaximenes is much more of what we might call an empiricist, and he attempts to explain change only by reference to what is observable. So he wanted to think about things that are observable with our eyes and ears and nose and mouth and our sense of touch, those kinds of things. He wanted to talk about what can be experienced, and he thought that this would provide a much greater assurance of accuracy than in what he had to say. So the idea of Anaximenes is that the things that exist exist in different stages of a continuum. So the basic stuffs and the basic properties or qualities of things that exist. So the stuffs being the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and the qualities or properties that we emphasize with Anaximander are these opposing qualities of hot and cold or wet and dry. And what Anaximenes had in mind was that these are not essentially opposed, but they're simply on different stages of a continuum. So hot and cold and wet and dry are not substances in themselves, but they are attributes or properties that something may have. So one thing may be hot at one time and cold at another time. The same thing may be wet at one time and dry at another time. These are the way we normally think about these ideas of hot and cold or wet and dry, not as substances in themselves, but as attributes or properties that things have. And so what Anaximenes had in mind is this idea of rarefaction and condensation. So each kind of stuff, which would include the four elements, each of these in the continuum can rarefy or condense into either of its neighbors. So we have a postulated chart here. The idea is that if you look at water, the third from the left on our diagram here, it can rarefy into cloud, right? Become more rare into a cloud, or what we might call a mist or fog, right? Or it could be condensed, and as it condenses, it becomes earth. And so the little dots in fire are supposed to represent how dense things are. And then as you move down the spectrum, they become more and more dense. We have earth nearly blackened, and then stone, of course, being extremely dense, so dense that you cannot make out the individual particles. So this is the idea of Anaximenes. We don't have these opposing forces. It's just this continuum of density. And so we have rarefaction going from more dense to less dense, and we have condensation going to more and more dense. So why, if we could have all of those elements at some place on the continuum, why pick air as the one arche that is more primary than anything else? Well, it seems that Anaximenes could have picked any of those other elements, the other things in the continuum, and he certainly rejected, as a lot of students do that we've talked about, the idea of the apeiron of Anaximander. Now, he did talk about air being indefinite in some ways, but not the infinite force that Anaximander talked about. So, and maybe it was because of his inclination towards empiricism. He didn't like the idea that Anaximander was talking about something that was unobservable, and he couldn't be certain of its existence because of that. It seems to be something along these lines why Anaximenes was taking the view that he did. Now, among the familiar elements that we know of the four most common elements, air is the most like the apeiron, as Anaximander conceived it, right? Because air is the most neutral of the elements. It doesn't seem to destroy any of the other elements, although you might say it's opposed to water. But the key here is that air can be cold or hot. We can experience cold air in the winter, hot air in the summer. Air can be moist or dry. Those foggy, moist days are common to our experience, but so are dry and arid days. And of course, these will vary according to your geography. So air can be observed, right? It can be felt, it can be seen to be more or less dense, right? So it can be foggy on the one side or arid on the other side. And air can be hot or cold. And interestingly, Anaximenes describes an experiment of sort. And I think this, it helps if you go ahead and try this. So if you put your hand up to your mouth, for example, and you blow air with your mouth wide open, you will sense the moistness and the heat of the air when you do that. Now, if you purse your mouth like you're whistling or making a small opening and then blow quickly onto your hand, you will feel it being cool, and it'll feel a little bit drier as well. So Anaximenes said that we could see this, we could experiment it with a simple test of allowing air to be more rarefied or having it be more condensed, and you get the sensation of hot or cold. So air may be understood as the arche in two ways, and we've talked about this with both Thales and Anaximander, so it's somewhat of a review here. One idea being of cosmogony, that in the initial stages all that exist was air, and then air was the source of everything else that exists. Air was the originating factor in the universe. So the idea here is that Y was made from X. X here would be air. Y could be any other element or anything else that exists. So everything that existed developed originally out of air. And Anaximenes describes it as unlimited. He also says that air is a god of sorts. So he does have this idea, at least when things were originating, that air was this force that kind of acted on its own. And he talks about our souls being air. And we have this phrase when somebody passes away that they took their last breath, right? And with that, sometimes people imagine the soul escaping at that point. Now, you could also understand air in that second way of being a constituent analysis, where you think of Y being made of X, so everything else is made of air. And that seems to be the way that he talks about it in some stages, just like he talks about air as an originating force. So everything that exists now is made of air. So air can change into anything that we can observe. And again, it's probably both of these ideas that Anaximenes had in mind. He thought of air being both the source of everything, but also as something that is the constituent, ultimate constituent of everything that exists. So that's similar to what Thales thought of with water. Now, if that's the case, if we think of Anaximenes' ideas in this way, and we have the idea of the rarefaction and condensation as I laid it out, and as I laid it out, we had cloud on that continuum. Air would be on the continuum as well. Maybe it takes the place of cloud, or maybe it's between air and cloud. It's not really sure, but it seems like that could be on the list of things that exist on the continuum. So we have this sliding scale for more or less rare, fire being the most rare, and then stone being the most condensed, but air is included on that scale, or AER would also be included on that scale. The challenge, though, is if that's the case, and we understand it that way, and we think of these particles that existed, well, wait a minute, what are the particles then that exist? What are the particles that are more or less condensed? Because if you say they are air, that's a contradiction, because air is a ratio of a level of condensation. Air has a certain degree of condensation. So air can't be a ratio of how condensed these particles are and also be the particles themselves. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction here if you think about these more carefully. Now, even so, even though there may be a contradiction, certainly many people have valued Anaximenes' progress, and I have an extended quote here from Jonathan Barnes in his book on the pre-Socratics, and I just wanted you to see the quote, and let's talk it through here. We need not embrace Anaximenes' conclusions in order to admire his principles and his methodology. Observations of a puzzle situation lead him to form explanatory theories of successively greater generality. And the final theory has many of the hallmarks of science. It's highly general, it's devastatingly simple, it explains the original puzzle, and it applies to and can therefore be tested against a mass of superficially unconnected phenomena. So he had this idea, he describes it, and then he tests it, for example, with the blowing air on your hand, and it has all these attributes of progress, right? The kinds of things that we want to see in a scientific theory or in a philosophical theory, things that can be highly general and applied to a lot of other things, but yet simple at the same time, something that we can grasp and understand. So Barnes has that praise, even though there might be a contradiction in his ideas. We can see that he's making progress here in understanding the universe. Now, just as a summary now, not merely of Anaximenes, but the other two Milesians that we've talked about, Thales and Anaximander, Anaximenes continues this philosophical spirit, this scientific experiment, trying to explain what exists and avoiding the appeals to anthropomorphic deities, right? There's no describing Zeus or Apollo or someone making the changes in air. It happens because of the nature of air itself for Anaximenes, and the same with Anaximander and the Apeiron, and the same with Thales and water. We have these ideas. Now, Anaximenes argued other things. Some of these are not in the text. He talked about rainbows being due to the sun's rays hitting dense, impenetrable clouds, and in a sense, that's pretty close, right? And instead of being caused by iris, a messenger of the gods. So that was the common way of thinking about rainbows, and Anaximenes postulated this more naturalistic, this more predictable way of thinking about rainbows. So this certainly seems to be progress. Now, it's true for all three of them, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. They're very important for attempting to formulate a rational answer to the question of the ultimate origin of things. Right? They all wanted to think about the arche, and one of which could provide a response to the question of how change occurs. So change is driving the ideas of the Milesians. They want to be able to explain how change happens, and in doing so, their metaphysics drives them to postulate an arche that will be able to explain the kinds of change that we experience. So very significant progress with these three figures, and we'll see other pre-Socratics both borrowing from and building on, or maybe responding to and rejecting the ideas that they have proposed.